May all beings have happiness and create the causes of happiness. May they all be free from suffering and creating the causes of suffering. May they find that noble happiness which can never be tainted by suffering. May they attain universal impartial compassion, free of worldly bias towards friends and enemies. Semchen tamche dewa tang dewe ju tang den pa ju tik, dungal tang dungal chichu tang trawa ju tik, dungal mepe dewa tampa tang min rawa ju tik, nering jak tang ni tang trawe tang nong chempo la ne pa ju tik. Okay, everybody, it's lovely to see all of you and all of you from London as well. It's nice to see all of you. And tonight, we're going to do a talk on a path from anguish to liberation, which is Lama Yeshe's Rinpoche's personal story. Now, the reason why I chose to do this tonight is because I really want it to be a discussion, much more than anything. I'm going to read some of the stuff from his book, which I really think is relevant and pertinent to all of us. I find that it's so amazing because it goes from psychology through to real liberation of your mind. And I think that what he really comes to the conclusion a lot about is that so many Westerners, their psychology trips up spirituality. So they can't attain enlightenment because the psychology is so messed up from so long ago. And I think what a lot of these lamas have realized is that Westerners and people from the East, I mean, maybe not so much now as earlier on, but people from the East have a different way of looking at their childhoods, at everything that they're doing. It's unbelievable because they really do have a different way of looking at it. But Westerners hang on to that. And I found that's what Lama Yeshe, his book, the book that he's written, which is quite gripping and hair-raising, called From a Mountain in Tibet. I really think you should all get it, and those that haven't read it should really read it because it's a very gripping story. It's like reading a novel, except it's true. And he said that he wrote the book. He told me personally that he wrote the book because he wanted it to be of benefit to all sentient beings. And he said because of all his experience with Westerners in retreat, he saw that their psychology trips them up, that their childhoods, they have so many grievances and stuff from their childhoods and from all their relationships that they hang on to, that they are not able to calm and tame their minds and so change. So I think that on the front cover, or right in the beginning of the book, it says, freedom is a choice we can all make. And listening to Taisitu Rinpoche, when he gave a talk 3 weeks ago on what is freedom, he said, you can't attain a single drop of freedom unless you can free yourself, unless you can free yourself from yourself. Now that's such an important thing because we can't really free ourselves from ourselves because we're bound by all the ideas we have, by all the biases, by all the conditionings that we have. And so many people struggle. And when I was in India, I saw that with the retreatants who were also around me. They were on a 4-year retreat. And they really struggled so much with their own psychology because in the East, you are given all these disciplines and practices, and the Western mind can't cope with it because of all the interference of all their psychology and stuff like that. Now, when we look at the psychology, it's you know, when you look at it, there's the human psyche, as I've told you a lot of times, wherein our regular relative psychology is. Then there's the alaya consciousness, which is where all our imprints are from previous lives, some from this life, but from previous life, which goes a lot deeper. And then there's your primordial consciousness, which is actually pure and whole, whatever you're going through. So we are looking at all those different levels. But if the human psyche stuff keeps intervening, then we definitely can't pass it in our meditation and go to any form of liberation. So I'll give you a lot of time to talk and ask questions, but the little summary of the book goes, now in his 70s, an abbot of the Samiling Monastery in Scotland, the first Tibetan Buddhist center in Europe, Lama Yeshe reflects upon his extraordinary life, and it was an extraordinary life, and the well of compassion and resilience that enabled him to triumph against tragedy and failure. From a Mountain to Tibet, in Tibet, is a powerful, deeply inspiring memoir that can teach all of us to overcome adversity, find peace, and live a meaningful life. Now, the thing is, lots of people can't find peace. And in this time, it's not always because of an external circumstance. With this COVID, it is a lot about an external circumstance, but it's your internal lack of peace. And I'm going to read you a lot of passages where he says, and then I'm going to open it up so all of you can discuss. But before we start, I just want to say that there was a beautiful quote from a book by Keith Dowman wrote, taking all the masters, and he said, to understand the distinction between the relative and the absolute is purely intellectual and delusive, but there must be a way, a doorway that is understood as non-dual. Non-dual means not you and me, absolutely everything together, a doorway into non-duality. The experience of walking through the door is like opening a door to the outside and allowing the air outside to merge with the air inside, while having the eyes open and looking. It is the experience of suddenly seeing. So it's the kind of experience when you're going through a really hard time that you suddenly get that insight and that vision, and then you aha. And he says, even in dreaming, it's the sudden recognition that we are dreaming. So there are many fascinating things that we can learn from the mountain in Tibet, not only by reading it, and I won't spoil it for you reading, because you really, to read all the exciting parts, it won't be spoiled at all, but by pondering the intertwining karma of his whole life story. And some things stood out in my mind as I read the story, and I know him so well as well, that one, as badly as he behaved, and he behaved shockingly. I'm sorry that John isn't here tonight, because he said to me, yeah, but the lamas are different to us. But that's why Lama Yeshe Rinpoche wrote this story, because he wanted people to realize that he was no different and that he went through the same trauma that they all did. Okay, but I didn't know how bad and how long it took, that badness. And how close to death he came so many times in his life. And no matter how bad he was always included in the special treatment that the higher lamas got, because he was with his brother, who was a tulku. That means you identify the incarnation that comes back and back and back, and Chogyam Trungpa, who was very, very, very powerful in those days, and somebody who really, really knew, and he was with both of them a lot. And so he always got very good treatment no matter what. And he always escaped death, even though sometimes you felt he should have been left to his own creations. So there was always a higher plan right through the story, which amazes me, really. And secondly, when we start to understand the truth about the fact, and this is very important to understand, that everything going on in this planet is just staged. It's just a display. If we could see it as it really was, it's just another displayed scene in dreamlike illusion. And then we discover that somebody who's totally exposed to the Dharma, to the truth, refuses to take it, because that's what happens to a lot of people who arrive at some kind of truth in their life, and they feel more of a pull towards samsara, the illusionary world. And it seems like his life story was staged, was set, and you can challenge me on this, was like displayed in order to teach others, because where he got to in the end was unbelievable through so much trauma. And he says when he hit rock bottom, and I'll read you some of those passages, but what this book says is that no matter what harsh, almost impossible to bear our outer circumstances are, there's an inner part of us, there's a real inner part of us that knows, number one, we will never find permanent happiness in any single outer situation. So if something really worked out in your life and you're feeling really happy, don't imagine it was going to stay like that. The Buddha taught no. Life as we know it is suffering, because it's going to end at some given point. Secondly, that every negative situation we land in is not permanent. And depending on how we look at it, we can really survive it. Thirdly, that if we use our inner true nature to deal with or surrender to, even if you can't do anything, you can't change your trauma, you can't change your situation, then we will be able to bear whatever we have to. And in this story, he is able to bear so many things you can't actually believe it. And fourthly, that we are the creators of this intolerable situation. And we need to resolve the imprints that we created previously. So especially where you have a repetitive situation, like a relationship doesn't work out, all your relationships don't work out for some reason, or you keep on having authoritarian people who browbeat you all the time in your life, or you have parents that do not understand you in any way, and then it seems like so many people in your life don't understand you. If you find, especially with a repetitive situation, there's an imprint, and you need to resolve that imprint. You can't leave this life with that imprint, because the one thing that we do know from Buddhism, and that the Buddha taught, was that the alaya consciousness goes with you. Therefore, the imprint goes with you. And if it's a deep imprint and really negative, and you haven't resolved it, once you're in the afterlife, it's almost too late to resolve it. You can't resolve it. And then it catapults you into the next incarnation, and then you've got those circumstances all over again. And I'm often saying to people, do you want these circumstances again? They go, no, are you crazy? Okay, well, then you have to do it. You have to resolve it now. So in other words, it doesn't really help to change the outer situation. Sometimes we can, for another supposedly better situation. We have to go inwards to get to that place of what we call in Buddhism one taste, one taste. That is such a beautiful idea, one taste. In all the prayers, you see one taste, one taste. One taste has such a deep meaning. It means that it doesn't matter what is going on. It doesn't matter how hard it is. It doesn't matter how beautiful it is. It's one taste. It's just going to come it's going to go. And that's really scary for all of us. It doesn't really make any difference, whatever situation we're in, because that situation that we are in is perfect for us at that moment. And if we can understand that and say, hang on, I'm going to change my view. This is the most perfect situation that I could be in. It's here, it's given to me to change something inside. If we know that it is perfect for us, then we stop resisting the change. And we allow the change from inside to actually catapult us into changing, because the outer, everything in the outer life reflects the inner life. So you have to change the inner before you can change the outer. And what is so important is, if you look on the planet now, the outer situation of everything from global warming to pandemics to coronavirus to the hatred and wars and anger and everything, it's because the inner state is completely out of balance. Therefore, what you see outside reflects the inner state en masse of people. We can't change the inner state of everybody, but we can change our own inner state. So the last paragraph I want to say, then I'm going to start reading from the book. Lama Yeshe Rinpoche, after a long war with life, a war, let me tell you, if you read it, you just can't believe it, okay? His brother, after a long war with life, with his brother, with most of the people around him, or at the time, hating his life, living selfishly, had to face all of this. And he found a place of perfect joy right where he was, no matter the circumstances. And he really did. He always says to me, when I speak to him on the phone, he always says to me, I am so blessed. I am so lucky. I have got so much. He says, I need so little. And yet I've got so much right where I am. But for 37 years, he only became a monk at 37. For 37 years, he was at war with life. And once you understand what I'm saying, finding that internal joy, then everything works spontaneously and is not contrived. Contrived, that means worked out by that human psyche based on all our conditioning. So I'm going to give you a lot of chance to challenge all this, but I'm just going to read a little bit from the introduction of the book. And it's very, very important because he starts off by speaking about how it was in Tibet in the 50s, okay? He says he was born in a place where there were no roads or motor vehicles, no electricity, no radios to bring news, no shops, no schools. They were really families that tended to their animals and their crops and all of that kind of thing, and that's how they were. But he says, as a child, I knew nothing of the tumultuous times that were encroaching on my idyllic world. He said, I didn't see a car until I was 15 years old. And he only saw a car when they left Tibet, and that was a hair-raising story. But then he says, since then, I've lived in the monastery where my brother was abbot, high on the freezing desert plains of eastern Tibet. I've lived in a refugee camp on a border between Tibet and India, then in a cramped flat in the 1960s in a drafty Victorian hunting lodge when I arrived in the UK, and in fancy, swanky private houses in London and New York. I've spent years living in a bare cell in solitary retreat, and many more years in the Buddhist monastic community of Samiling that my brother co-founded in the late 1960s. Now I am an old man of 77, and I still live at Samiling, which has been my home for most of my life. The view from my window is of green rolling hills, as it was when I was a child. But now I live near Lockerbie in Scotland, and the Tibet of my childhood is no more. My life has been far longer than I ever expected, and I am content when I survey its contours. Every turn, however challenging or unexpected, has brought me to this place where I am able to offer reassurance and guidance to anyone who is seeking peace. This is my most deeply held wish, that more and more people will begin to tame their unquiet minds so that they may be able to live joyfully and to offer compassion to every living being on this earth. During my time as a teacher, many people have come to me with stories of hopelessness. They are so disheartened that they genuinely believe they have no chance of freeing themselves from their issues. They feel too much has gone wrong in their lives. They tell me about the traumas they're carrying, the difficult childhood, the parent who was not there for them, the youthful transgressions, abusive or failed relationships, the addictions, the bereavements, all the messy things of life that have left them feeling like a failure or irredeemably hurt or lost. I reply that these stories may appear to them to represent reality, but that I see things and see them quite differently. I insist that change is possible for every single one of us, however broken or exhausted we may feel. It's not easy, I know well, but each difficult experience we have struggled with, every challenge we face, is the raw material for our transformation. Such an important statement, the raw material. In other words, the material that is there is actually, if you're able to turn the material in another direction, it's the same material, but it's now reflecting a completely different, pure state. And he says, all our sorrow, suffering, and confusion can be the basis for our unique process of change. Nobody is beyond hope. Sometimes the person's response that this may be true for someone like me, a Lama, a holy man born into a culture in which Buddhism was part of their everyday life. But it doesn't apply to them, they tell me. They say to me, Lama Yeshe, you are not like me. I am not like you. The implication seems that they are destined to remain stuck, while I was born with some mystical faculty for evading suffering, which they themselves lack. This is not the case. I'm certainly not that different and not special, not at all. He says, I was born into a religious feudal system and I fled my homeland at the age of 15. And 300 of them left Tibet, and only 13 arrived in India. They went through 9 months of hell, which a lot of you know the story. He says, but then again, those experiences are unusual. But then again, I've been a refugee, an immigrant, an Asian man living in a small town where there were few other Asians. And he says, those experiences are not unusual. Millions of people have lived them, and I have felt deep frustration and resentment, have been a disappointment to my immediate family and myself, a layabout without a sense of purpose, a man desperately searching for peace. I've been selfish, self-indulgent, a failure. I've lost the person I loved most in the world. All that, I suggest to anyone who tries to tell me I'm different, makes me just like them. Perhaps the only thing that does distinguish me from many of those people I speak to, mainly Westerners, is that I have spent many years purifying my mind to enable it to settle easily into positivity rather than cling to negativity. It has not been an easy task, but I never thought it was impossible because I have faith in the essentially positive nature of the mind. If we can change our mental orientation, then everything else will follow. In Buddhism, mind is king. And he says, I've never forgotten the man who described himself to me as damaged goods. I could see the powerful hold that this idea of his own flawed nature had on me. And it shocked me because it was so alien to the way I view myself, my people, in the world. In Buddhism, we start from the understanding that there's always a part of us that is perfect and perfectly at peace. At the core of every human being is an innate goodness and intelligence called your Buddha nature or your awakened nature. It has been my life's work to find that part of myself in order that I might demonstrate to others that they too have the potential to find their own and so bring about personal transformation. When such change is sought sincerely for the express purpose of bringing more peace and happiness into the wider world, not for selfish gain, it will always come to pass. May this book offer hope and guidance to all who seek them. So I'm going to throw it open now because I've given you a whole lot of things before, going into how we can really change and what the real meaning of life is about. And it's not just what we think. So let me hear from a few of you what you think, or comments you want to make, or questions, or anything. Or challenges.
I have something I want to ask.
My dearest granddaughter, I'm so happy.
You're saying at the beginning about like how everything is kind of like an illusion, to people. So when you go through hardships, you like kind of tell them it's all an illusion life, and you can get through them because of that. But could you do in the opposite direction, that life is an illusion, so people will just kind of like give up on it very easily?
You see, that's interesting what you say, because the thing is that you have to learn to have the vision that it's an illusion. But I thought you were going to say, but then people say, but I'm going through such a terrible time.
And that as well, yeah. And that as well.
You know what? Once you really understand that, not intellectually, once you really understand that this is a dream. I mean, when we do Tibetan dream yoga, we actually start off the practice to awaken in our dream state, but we go, life is just a dream, life is just an illusion, life is just a dream, this is not real. Now, obviously, it feels real for a lot of people. It really does feel real when you're going through sorrow and pain. But I think that if people just gave up living because they thought it was an illusion, and I think some people do, I think some people take their own lives, some people do all kinds of things, but not because it's an illusion. I think when you can see that it's an illusion, you can somehow get through it. Like if you know that this life is a dream, and if I can resolve it, I'm going to wake up on the other side of the dream. I mean, when you're in a dream, what do you say in the morning when you're having a nightmare? Phew, I'm so pleased it was a dream. Doesn't make you rebel or anything like that, or give up life. I think people give up life much more, not when they realize it's an illusion, but when they think they can't get past their hardships and their traumas and their pain and their suffering. I think that's when people give up life. And it's so sad to me, because there's so much to resolve it. There's an inner way to resolve it. There really, really is. And if people understood that, we'd have a much better world. I mean, the suicide rate apparently during this COVID era is extreme. I once read some statistic. So I don't think thinking it's a dream makes people think, I don't think you can think, well, now I can kill you because it's a dream, because there's something relative that you're going to have to face, the karma on a relative level. Even though it's a dream, you're going to have to go through a nightmare. But that's a good question, Jessie.
Thanks.
Anyone else on all of that? There's a lot there to think about. Okay.
So Mel, can you I know you've been through it, but how do you get to that happy state? How do you, if you're stuck, how do you get there? It's all very well change your feet, become positive. How do you do that?
Yeah. You see, it's not about becoming positive. And that is the whole purpose. That's the whole purpose of how we learn to go on a spiritual path and we meditate. A lot of people say to me, you know what? I'm not going to meditate. I'm not going to do the practices. I'm not going to do anything. I don't mind listening to some of the Buddhist philosophy, but I'm not going to do any of the practices. But the thing is, the practices are what make us able to cope, because the practices take us from that karmic vision, the way we see things with our absolutely limited human intellectual potential or psyche, to that primordial consciousness. Now, the primordial consciousness actually knows fully, the primordial consciousness knows fully that this is just something you need to go through, and it's all going to change, and it's all going to be different. So what did you want to say, Eugene?
No, I think when people say that they don't want to do the practices, I think it's a comfort zone, because if you want to listen to the wisdom, it's like I want to hear, but I think people are not really ready to face themselves or face themselves truly.
Exactly.
Because the practices is about sitting still and looking at your habits. It is about examining yourself. It is like, am I making this life meaningful? Am I in a samsaric trap that's going to lead me like to the execution stables, but I think it's going to be fine? It like, is all of this permanent? So if you do, so I think it's, because I think they love the I, the self-constructed I, more.
Sorry, you've gone off.
Eugene.
We can't hear you.
Mel, not everybody is a Buddha, or not everybody goes with the teachings. So somebody that is teachings, how then can you get there?
You see, I just want to say, Marcel, that what is very important is, even without the practices, meditation. That's what this book is all about. How Lama Yeshe Rinpoche had to sit in meditation. And I'll read you the extracts about how, just what Eugene was saying now, like when you've got to be alone. I know in this COVID time, you can absolutely, people are in such dark spaces, okay? And the reason they're in dark spaces is they can't face themselves. But as soon as you go into meditation on any long-term basis, all that muck comes up, okay? Now, the thing is, there are special techniques to actually see it, because when you start doing insight training and you start looking into the mind and you start seeing those emotions, you see that they are absolutely impermanent. They're made of the same substance as everything. I'll read you some of the extracts because it's really important. He actually tells this. But in the beginning of his retreats, all he wanted to do was run away. He said when he had to face all the stuff inside him, and he didn't have a Western background, he actually had a very stable childhood, for the first 15 years. But he says when he had to face himself and all the darkness that was inside, people can't do it. But I've got to say that sometimes, and I was talking to somebody about that today, sometimes it is important to have your own therapy to be able to deal with that in the midst of your spiritual growth, because sometimes you need somebody to guide you through what you are going to have to do, and through facing that darkness. But the thing is that in the meditation, which we'll do in a few minutes, You have to just allow those feelings to come up. Now, we are trained to repress them, to get rid of them, to express them negatively. We're trained like that all the time. And so we never allow them to come up and actually see their absolute non-solidity, which they are. They're non-solid, they're illusionary. We see that, but only when you do the meditation. So meditation is really the way, which is a universal thing. You could do meditation in Judaism, in Christianity, you could do it in anything. It's really very important when you are able to do it.
Mel's. Hello,
Yes.
Mel.
Darling, how are you?
So I was just reading something now that on Thich Nhat Hanh, I think that he's not well.
Yeah,
But I just wanted to read this to you, and I want to just see, because it seems like such a paradox and such an opposition that you actually get, I feel sometimes I get torn between the truth and the relative.
Okay.
So just let me read this to you. I just want to read this, what he wrote here. No, he just says, I'm not, wait, oh, flip, I have to, yeah. This body is not me. I'm not limited by this body. I'm life without boundaries. I have never been born and I have never died. So when you talk about the klesha consciousness and the karma and all that, actually, in the absolute truth, it's actually irrelevant.
Absolute. It's
And why
absolute.
is this paradox and this relative, and you feel so torn?
I know, but you see, it's all training. It's all training. That's what all these masters have done. I mean, when you did your lovely talk on your illness and everything, people were really inspired with it, Hale. And it was because how can you approach a really deep illness that's eating away at your body? You can only approach it with a different view. And when you actually see it with a different view, what he's saying there is, and apparently he's passing over now. I saw that. It's absolutely exquisite, because what was asked of all the communities all over the world was to take whatever he's taught and just put it into the world. So I found that really lovely what you're saying. But what he's saying is, no matter what your temporary circumstances are, there actually is no birth, there actually is no death. And if you can, and if you can understand that, you can pass right through any difficult circumstances, no matter how hard they are.
I think the direct experience or the direct awareness, only you can experience it. No one can say to you that, because it's at the end of the day, it's, you have to just recognize.
No, you're absolutely right. But when you've got somebody actually explaining it to you like he did to so many Westerners in the book, it does help. Because if you've got somebody who says, I mean, if you're going on a journey and you don't know how to get there and you haven't got a map and you haven't got anything, and someone says, turn left, turn right, go this way, then turn down that road, it's a great help, because they're pointing out the way for you, okay? And that helps tremendously. But what is important is, and I really say this, that he's very different to the average Lama, because he really can take that Western psychology, look at it, and help you to go past it, which a lot of these Lamas, they can't, because they don't really understand the extent of what we feel. And we are, because we come from a place of really being conditioned like that.
Yeah.
Let's go to the next little paragraph, okay, which was, I marked all the things I wanted to give you, which was having emotional suffering in your childhood. So he said they were this big extended family, and there were aunts, and if your mother couldn't feed you, you went to your aunt, which makes a hang of a difference when you live in an extended family, because there are always people. And he said, we spent hours eating and chatting. We often ate 6 small meals a day, accompanied by stories and jokes. Life seemed to overflow with laughter and with love. Even on the most basic level, I lacked for nothing. If I was hungry, all I had to do was cry and roll over, and my mother would come and feed me. If she was busy or in a bad mood, I would simply run off and find another adult who would welcome me as one of their own. Well, I think he needed a childhood like that to go through what he went through afterwards. But he said, it was the strong sensation of safety and security that was, I think, the defining characteristic of my childhood. And it has served me well throughout my whole life. Many of the Western people who come to see me nowadays are suffering so much at an emotional level. And for many of them, the issue seems to stem from their childhood. They tell me that they do not feel good enough. They do not feel lovable. When they were growing up, they were lonely or emotionally deprived, and they feel insecure and unsafe even as adults. This makes me wonder why so many people grow up in a world of material comfort and individual freedom with educated and well-informed people around to take care of them, and yet feel a gnawing lack in their heart. I do not judge anyone, and I encourage those who come to me to let go of their often deep-seated tendency to blame others, particularly their parents, for their own distress. Modern society makes it so hard for parents to give their children the emotional support and security they need. There are just so many pressures, and most parents didn't receive proper parenting themselves. He says, Tibetans greatly value their lineage and the received wisdom going back through the ages. But it strikes me that many parents in the West never inherited a sense of what it's like to be an emotionally integrated human being. And I think that's true. To make matters worse, children are under so much pressure to perform academically and become successful. And he says they get into this, their only option is to suppress the emotional pain and get onto the relentless treadmill to succeed. When as adults, they start to meditate, and here it is, Marcel, where are you now? You've changed really. When they actually begin to meditate, this emotional pain resurfaces, as I later discovered when I began to guide and mentor Western students of Buddhism. My many conversations over the years have made me value even more my own experience of a world where adults and children were together so much, able to listen and pay attention to each other. We children were seen, heard, valued, and contained. We knew where we belonged. And we also were connected by our belief in the Buddhist teachings and the word of faith. Okay, now he says, if we've grown up without it, it's never too late to recreate links with others in our own lives, families, and communities. Every relationship starts from an impulse to open ourselves to another being. When we are generous with our attention and our care, empathy flows and compassion becomes possible. Most of the many important Buddhist ideas about joy and compassion living begin with the realization that none of us exist in isolation. Interconnectedness is essential to our being. Isolation is a delusion. I offer this thought as a starting point for your own voyage of personal change, positive change. So it's hard. It's hard to think maybe that people have actually grown up in a family where they didn't get the attention and they didn't get what they needed. But why did they get that family in the first place? Who created it? I mean, thinking about it, you know, how come some people have beautiful families and some people have terrible families? What is it? Who created it? How did you get there? Interesting question.
You got
So
there from, so basically, I think, so there's always, I mean, it's independent origination.
Okay.
I mean, that's how I think that it's how it all manifests, because, I mean, it's from the, you cannot even find the beginning. There's no ways you can ever find the beginning. or the end.
So what does that mean?
It means that it's just it's on and on and on and on. It's a moment before the moment before the moment before. Where are you ever going to find the beginning? Never.
Who wants to find the beginning?
But that people say, where do I come from? What's it all about? You're saying, where does this family come from? That's where it comes from.
No, it comes from the fact that we created a family before that wasn't able to be caring and compassionate. And now we are catapulted into a family that isn't able to be caring and compassionate. Now, what happens, which you'll see later on, when people start drinking and drugging and doing all kinds of things instead of, looking at why they were in that family, they just blame and blame and blame. My mother didn't do this for me, and my father did that for me, and my mother didn't understand me. How did they get there in the first place? I mean, when are we going to take responsibility for this? When are we going to stop blaming everybody? When are we going to open our eyes and decide, yeah, I'm actually in the right situation. I'm actually in the perfect situation for me to learn. So always when people come to me and they say, my mother this, my mother that, my mother this, I can't get over it, I can't do it, I can't anything. I always ask them after a while to look at what the mirror-like wisdom was for them. What was the mirror showing them? And could they look in that mirror? Now, Marcel, most people can't, okay? Because isn't it just easier when you've got an angry person in front of you? Isn't it just easier to blame them for what they've done to you? Or you've got somebody that really lets you down. Isn't it easier to say, you let me down, you did this to me, that's why I can't survive. You didn't do that, you didn't do that. At which point do we actually look in the deep, mirror-like primordial wisdom and actually see that the wisdom, the mirror, is reflecting something to us that comes from inside us. And therefore, we better learn the lesson quickly and speedily. Interesting. I mean, and he really does. And one of his paragraphs in his book, just a little paragraph, he says he was always rebellious. When his father said, come, I'm going to teach you to read and write, because they didn't have formal schooling or anything. He used to run out to play. He said he always rebelled and found a way to get out. And he says even when he was in retreat later on, he was looking for a way out all the time, And he says, this rebellious streak was a defining feature of the first half of my life. On those tedious afternoons in Darak, I discovered I had a knack for escaping from whatever it was I was supposed to be doing. And I spent the next 30 years as an escape artist from any situation or expectation that didn't suit me. That's quite an admission, don't you think? You're laughing, Lindy. I mean, isn't it? He was an escape artist. He managed, and I know lots of escape artists. There's so many people. And I mean, when you go into retreat, when I go and conduct any retreat, and you just watch the people in retreat, I mean, it's unbelievable. I remember once when we were in India, you might have been there that time, Kathy. A few of you, Mimi, you might have been there. I'm not sure if you are. Yeah, I think you were on that trip. But what happened was we got this beautiful teaching from Tai Situ Rinpoche. It was really, it bowled me over. But I remember one young girl who came on the trip. You might have been there, Haley, I'm not sure. One young girl who came on the trip with her mother. She couldn't bear the teaching. She couldn't bear the retreat. She couldn't bear anything about it. It was the most unbelievable opportunity. And she came to me and she said to me the one day, I can't bear being here, and I'm sorry, I'm going to Dharamsala. I said, please don't. This is the most wonderful opportunity of your whole life. You may wake up to it in a little while. Anyhow, she did go. But then when the teaching was finished, I said to everybody, I took this big group to India, and I said to everybody, okay, now we're going to go and meditate for the whole weekend. Okay, so it was just like, I don't know, maybe a Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. We're going to digest everything, and what I'll do is I'll just come around to all of you so that if there are any issues you have. So one person, I remember in the group, said, I'm going skydiving. Okay, so a whole lot of people in the group, this is called escape artists, decided to go skydiving that weekend. And one girl who said to me, well, I'm going into my retreat, in my room, staying there. She was gone the next day, okay? Even for 2-3 days after this beautiful teaching, they just ducked to go skydiving. Now that's what he's talking about, okay? Because most of us...
Excuse me. Mel, no. I have to interrupt. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I have to interrupt because I was on that trip, and I'm just going to say to everyone, for me, it wasn't skydiving, it was another thing. We ran off the mountain. However, for me, I don't know about everyone else, it wasn't an escapism for me. I just felt that it was an opportunity, especially for the price, that we'll never ever get again, to fly over the Himalayas and see the temple, the whole Sherabling from the sky. For me, it was a beautiful experience. I didn't want to run away from the teachings.
Okay, no, that's fine. I'm not giving that as a generalization. I'm just telling you that we were going to do unbelievable retreat and depth thing. And I can understand people want to, but I'm just saying in general, most Westerners can't sit with themselves. They can't sit quietly because stuff comes up. It's really scary for people. Stuff comes up and they have to face themselves. And this is what he said. I was an escape artist. I just every time. You'll see when he was in his retreat, every time he thought of something else that he could do to get out of his retreat. Look, we all like that. I know that when I go to India and I'm on retreat, the first couple of days are torture. Because the minute you settle, the minute you sit down, all the stuff starts coming up. And if you can see it through, I remember once sitting at the Karmapa's monastery, and his apartment was there, and my room was here, and I didn't like that monastery at all. I had to go because there were no permits for Westerners. And I remember just going to the Karmapa, and there were all these security people, and you could hardly get anywhere near him. And finally, I got to have this interview with him. And he stood there like this with his arms folded, and he said, "What do you want?" You know? And I couldn't believe he was so strong and so powerful, and all these security people around. And I just said, "Your Holiness," I don't know where this came from. I said, "I just want you to clean me up." And so he said, it was unbelievable. He said, okay, and the interview was over. That was the interview that I waited for about 4 hours to have. Okay, and then I went to my room, and he did it. Okay, for the next week or two, I spent most of my day sobbing. But what was interesting, because he was cleaning me up, he was making me remember even previous lifetimes and things like that. It's really quite an experience. But as soon as I was sobbing a lot, and as soon as I had finished sobbing, what was so interesting is I got up off the pillow, my pillow was wet, I was sitting on the floor, and suddenly I asked myself, why was I crying again? I couldn't remember why I was crying. It was absolutely gone. And then I said to myself, when I come home and I teach people, I need to remember, but I couldn't remember anymore. It was just things that came up, and I cried and cried.
But Mel,
Yes.
when people go on that pilgrimage,
Yes.
and they meet any high Lama, and it's happened to myself, they find that they cry out of the blue, and if you actually ask them what are they crying about, they don't know. And it's like an energy adjustment, knowing that you have been given this enormous energetic blessing that is starting to change some paradigm within yourself. And it's really a blessing, because although it's cleaning up the dark stuff, you don't really have to consciously go through the dark stuff, because it's giving you the confidence to move, to flow, to be in the flow without the resistance and the rebelliousness and the finding a way out, not to look at it. In fact, you don't really need to have a look at it when that stuff happens, and you just cry yourself clean, and I found that.
But I didn't know when it started, I didn't know what the stuff was.
Yes.
But then when I was finished crying, it was gone. So I actually knew, but I know what you're saying as well, and that's a deep feeling that you have. But the point is that in answer to Marcel's question, it's like really, really important to understand that we go past this. Ask Eugene. When Eugene was doing his Nondra practice, I mean, look what was coming out for you, Eugene. Right. And I mean, I know what you're saying, because when I did that practice, stuff was coming out of my pores. It's unbelievable. It really, really does a million things to you,
Yeah.
Right.
And I think if you do these practices, because when you're young, I'm starting to sound old now. So when you're younger, so you're so certain of yourself, because you know, that identity is so ingrained. I'm this person, these are my parents, this is my framework of reference, this is how the world works, and this is right and this is wrong. And then you get knocked, and then you find Buddhism, and then you start to really start to question that kind of stuff. Am I really intrinsically all of that kind of labels I put on myself, and all these things that I used to put so much energy into, and that was so important, do they really define me, or was it just a way for me to cope, or to kind of navigate the world at that point in time? So it's interesting when you do the practices, because then you continuously try to learn yourself, but it's very insidious as well. You think you make progress, and then you do, and then before you find yourself, you're off on another spiral. So that's why I keep on doing my non-draw and stuff.
I know, but do you understand why that is? Because can you understand the mountains and mountains of stuff, from mountains and mountains of incarnations? I mean, it's not just from one incarnation. This is just the culmination of hundreds of incarnations that we carry that stuff. But ultimately, we don't carry anything, and ultimately, there's nothing there. And what was interesting is that Lama Yeshe's journey in his escape is really, really, really very, very interesting, because they went through 9 months and a lot of starvation and everything when they set out, all of them, with animals, with equipment, with food, with everything. And in the end, they had to give all of that up because they were running away from the Chinese and everything. And it's so interesting because Chogyam Trungpa at that time was a diviner. So he used to go off and go into meditation to see which path they should take and things like that. I mean, it was absolutely unbelievable. But I think that what is so important is when you read it here, he says, when I was told that we were preparing at the beginning to leave the monastery and make our way to Lhasa, I felt a surge of excitement, because he was sent to Akon Rinpoche's monastery in Tibet and he didn't want to be there. He hated it. He said, finally, I was going to escape my personal hell. He hated being there. And he says, my naivety makes me wince now. He makes him wince now. How could I have been so utterly bound up in my own suffering that I took even the overrunning of my country as little more than a personal release? I was 15. You know, if you think of yourself at 15, I mean, we weren't exactly the genii of the world. You know, I mean, we were there. Well, I was certainly this rebellious little adolescent, you know, going through all my stuff. So he was only 15. He says, I was 15, that's how. I had all the self-obsession of any young person combined with a great deal of pride and resentment. Change had come for me at last. Okay, and he says, every life is of course full of fluctuations. My companions and I in Dharma Lakan had been living in a world ostensibly unchanged in hundreds of years. We'd all assumed that it would endure for many hundreds more. In fact, it was destroyed in a matter of months. On a moment-to-moment level, though, every one of us, from trainee monks to the servants in Labra, lived with constant internal change. Our thoughts and moods ran endlessly through our minds. Even I, with my story of how my life had frozen into a predictable shape, had a dynamic inner life. Emotions came and went. I pined for the past, and I daydreamed for the future. I had glimmers of satisfaction when I accomplished something in my studies. I fumed against my brother, Akon Rinpoche. I fumed against him all the time. I wondered what my mother was doing. That was direct evidence of impermanence. And so he said, I spent most of my time feeling resentful in the monastery, which made it impossible for me to see it as an opportunity to learn about the wisdom of the Buddha, about myself and my potential. If I had been able to feel grateful for this opportunity, which is so interesting, I might have been able to grow. As it was, I hankered after the past and resisted the present. I was truly stuck, a prisoner in my own circumstances, so much so that I interpreted the Chinese invasion of my homeland as my personal liberation. I was, in short, a typical human being. Interesting. Most of us, he says, live as if we are half asleep. Very interesting, don't you think? Because I think that, you know, he says with typical human being, and I think that when we really understand the whole purpose of our suffering, what our suffering is for, like he really does understand in this book and teaches it, the different arrows of suffering, what they mean to us, I think then we can start to develop a depth and a real, you know, a real understanding. Anyone want to say anything? Then I'm going to read you about the suffering because I think it's very interesting. Anyone want to say anything? A typical human being, which we all are. Okay, so I'm just going to read this part that he says, in the 7 months that had passed since I trotted out of the monastery, I've been forced to dig deeply into the lessons it had taught me. I hadn't noticed at the time, but Dharma Lakang, that was the monastery, had given me a basic training in forbearance, faith, and trust. Unwittingly, I'd absorbed enough of these qualities to survive the suffering that awaited me. In Buddhism, we say that dukkha, or suffering, is inevitable. It comes as an integral part of being alive. The situation I found myself in was an extreme one in terms of external afflictions. But then every life is full of suffering. The people we love don't love us back, or they die. We are disappointed at work. We want to have a child and we're unable to, or we're in conflict with the children we do have. We get ill, we lose our job. The list of ways in which we suffer is endless. It's how we respond to these painful events that will determine the extent and duration of our suffering. The Buddha told us something very powerful of this in one of his teachings. He remarked that all of us will be struck by the arrow of suffering, and most of us will be struck by a second arrow. The first is the inevitable pain of life, all those hurtful experiences that we've listed. Even the most highly realized person will be afflicted in this way. It's the second arrow that does the real damage, though. It lands in the same painful spot as the first, and it aggravates the wound. This is the arrow of resistance or avoidance of the pain. Can I read that again? The second arrow, which hits in the same spot, okay, is the arrow of resistance or avoidance of the pain. The Buddha called it resistance obsession. You know, ducking. Okay, I'm coming to the ducking because we want to avoid the pain. It typically takes one of three forms. The first is characterized by a desire to escape the pain through reliance on a numbing substance such as alcohol, or rumination on the past, or daydreaming about the future. The second is to fight it by being judgmental and controlling with oneself or others. The third is simply to tune out by distracting oneself in some fashion, such as with excessive busyness. None of these reactions is very effective in the long term. In fact, they simply encourage the original wound to fester. To these two arrows, you might want to add a third, the belief that because we've been struck by these arrows, there must be something wrong with us. We conclude that if we fail to evade the second arrow, we must be terribly flawed and uniquely unworthy. I observed that this third arrow is very common among Westerners. It has almost fatally wounded many of the people who come to see me. And when I think back to this period of my own life, I can see that during my time in Ekong's monastery, I was grievously wounded by the second arrow. I tried to escape the pain of being wrenched from the world I knew by daydreaming about it constantly. I also fought it with resentment and aggression directed at Ekong. Once our escape was underway, though, something changed in the way I responded to painful events. The arrows of pain kept coming at me, but I reacted to them far less. I can't say this because I'd learned to be wise and apply the balm of compassion to those arrow wounds. I was still only 15 and a long way off such insight. Now it's plain to me, though, that I had learned enough to grasp that my suffering, as we slogged over the mountain passes and my belly began to cramp with hunger, would only be made worse by railing against it. The situation was so extreme that it demanded neither fury nor avoidance nor passivity, but forbearance, which is so interesting. And somehow I managed that. There was the example of my brother Ekong and Trumpa, who were my teachers, and there was the collective effort among our whole group to avoid that second arrow. We only succeeded partially, of course, but it was enough to ensure that we survived. Now let's talk about those arrows, because arrow number 1, everybody gets. Arrow number 2, again, deep into the heart of pain. But what do? We try and avoid it. Why? Can't we see when the arrow comes? Can't we see that it's hitting the target that it needs to hit there? It's interesting, very, very interesting. What do you think, Pete?
Mel, do you want us to answer why?
Yeah, I want you to answer, because
or maybe, I mean, I'm just thinking maybe it's our unbelievable attachment to the body, to the mind body.
Okay, but what do you mean? What do you mean?
So we're so attached to the body and the mind and this relative physical realm,
Yeah.
that when that pain comes, we just think it's like, it's so it consumes the body more than the body and the mind, and not and when the real self is not even stained by that, but we don't see it because we're covered with veils.
Okay, we covered with veils, but I mean, wouldn't it be easy if you get wounded now? So you're going through really extreme suffering and you get wounded and then you get wounded again. Wouldn't it be easier to just stop and look? It's so interesting, I think, when he talks about the second arrow and the third arrow, because I really think, and he says the Buddha called resistance obsession. Why are we so resistant to suffering situations? I remember reading about one Lama where they were going on this car journey, and they caught his hand in the car door, and it was really he really had a sore thing. And this guy actually said that when they said, oh, we're so sorry, Rinpoche, we caught your hand in the door, and he said, don't worry, that paid for a lot of things that I've done in the past. How many of us could say somebody sues you or pinches all your money or something, and all we want to do is go to court? That arrow strikes and we want to get back our money and we want to get them into jail. But maybe we're so lucky. Maybe they're giving us a chance to pay back for something we did. We never look at it. We just resist. We resist and we blame and we fight. I think on their journey from Tibet to India, they actually had no choice, because every minute of the journey was wrought with terrible obstacles and people just dropping dead. And then his brother, he loved his other brother, not Ekong. Ekong he was fighting with right up until he became a monk, and then he loved and adored him, and he began to understand what he'd done for him. But his other brother always petted him and looked after him, and he was around. And this brother at one point in the journey just disappeared, because so many people of their party of 300 got shot. They were crossing this river in these little homemade boats that they'd made, and a whole lot of them got shot by the Chinese, and his brother disappeared completely. And he says in the book, that brother was his life, and when he disappeared, he just thought, well, he's dead. But he just went on. He just couldn't resist that. He just went on, and he was 15 years old then. So not easy to do that. But then towards the end of their journey, his brother rocked up again. His brother got caught by the Chinese with a whole lot of people, and they escaped from this prison that the Chinese put them in. They escaped. And he managed to get a little bit of food. They were all starving. They were boiling their saddlebags to try and drink a little bit of the fat that came off the saddlebags just to stay alive. And suddenly his brother was there again with a whole packet of food for all of them that were left. I think they just became immune. There was no way that they could actually change the suffering. It was just, how are we going to get this together? And they knew they had this nature inside that would survive this. But what do you all think in terms of your own lives? Pete, I was asking you, in terms of the second arrow.
Well, Mel, you know what, I think, you know, we tend to live in our own little bubble, our own little comfort zone.
Yeah.
So, you know,
quite right.
I don't know. That's how I see things, and you know, it's just the way we are.
Yeah.
Is it the way we are, or is it the way we become because we're resisting the resistance obsession that the Buddha taught? Because all we're looking for is for good things to happen in our lives. That's what we're looking for good things. As long as good things are happening, we're okay. But isn't it time we actually looked and we thought maybe the second arrow, which is right into my womb, this is giving me the most amazing opportunity.
Yeah.
Marcel, I can see that little grin under your face. Let's hear. Well, you can ask your friend Louis what he thinks about all of this. Yeah.
But Mel, is it not our conditioning and our beliefs? I mean, we're born with a clear mind. We become, like you said, and it's also like faith-based religion, like God this, God that, God the other. And it's all faith-based. It's not even like, so it's like you learn that from your parents, the rabbis, whoever tells you all the bullshit.
I know, but Haley, the bottom line is that no matter
we become this.
You do become that, but the point is we're now trying to undo because we're looking at the world. The world is really suffering badly. The arrows are coming hard and fast. You see people in the streets, they're absolutely desperate. They've got absolutely nothing. Every single robot you stop at, there's another person desperate. And so we have to start questioning that relative superficial thing that we've been conditioned to, and open our eyes to another way that we can reach out, another way that we can understand things from a different point of view. Because why does the first arrow is just the general suffering that everybody goes through. The second arrow is the arrow that goes right into the wound of the original arrow. Now, shouldn't we be celebrating? Because if the wound is bad enough, we will definitely start asking and start looking.
So Minjar described it slightly different. So he said the first arrow is the pain that you experience. And the second arrow, if you attach to it, you attach to the pain. And you then make where the first arrow, you can experience it, but you can detach yourself from it because you know your ultimate self is not affected. Okay. So it's the ego self that then attaches to the second arrow, and then, oh Lord, why me? This is not fair. Like it always happens to me. Like, why do other people have it good and I don't? So it helps you to kind of like, he says, like, if you, it can be a great teacher for you to say, oh, yeah, actually, that is not the real me. Like so he says, if you can stop yourself from attaching between the first and the second arrow, you can actually have that moment where you can recognize your original self.
Thank you.
But it's very hard.
Thank you. I agree, but how many of us can stop in between the first and the second arrow? Like Hale, you're just saying, we're so conditioned to that light. But why does the arrow have to go a second time? Couldn't we have learned it from the first time? How many people do we have to lose before we actually understand what life is about?
What do you mean, how many people do we have to lose? Because that's life. I
I
mean,
know, but I'm saying,
suffering is part of life. So how can we stop that? We
see, we
can't.
can't stop the suffering,
Yeah.
but we can stop the view.
The pain.
No, we can't stop the pain. The pain is
Pain is
inevitable.
necessary.
And the pain is the teacher, and the pain is there.
But Mel, can I say something, Mel?
Yes, of course.
Mel, I'm sure you taught us years ago, like if you see a beggar or somebody on crutches with one leg, you know, that's his karma. He's got to deal with it. We don't have to really feel sorry for him. He's got to work through that himself. So,
But
you know.
see, no, but I disagree with that. I don't think that's exactly what I said. But if you see the person on the side of the road, yes, that person is struggling with not one arrow, but with a whole lot of arrows of suffering. That doesn't mean to say you don't feel absolute compassion for that person. But when we talk about the view is a certain sense of gratitude for going through this, because you know you're cleaning the slate, you know you're clearing out the human psyche, you know all of this. And so it's like really, really important to see this, because when you know this, you can bear it. You can see what is it in me that needs to change. You need to change your view from the karmic perception, which is the way you've always been conditioned to look at things, to the perception which is much more real about why this is really happening to you, about what this is that you're really needing to learn. And so I agree with Eugene there. Peter, it doesn't mean we don't feel compassion because somebody's going through a whole stack of arrows, but we do have that kind of understanding, and I try and make that understanding to people when they're going through a lot of arrows, and like, this is going wrong, and this is going wrong, and this is going wrong. And sometimes I actually say to these people, just stop and just look inside. See why life is offering you all these arrows of suffering, and see if you can get a different perspective of it all. Because
don't you say thank you for all these arrows that I'm
well, you should, but it's pretty hard. I agree.
Yeah.
We should be saying thank you, and the masters do say thank you. And when you read Lama Yeshe's book, he actually says thank you 1,000,000 times for all the hardships and the arrows that he went through. But he also keeps saying the arrows were self-created. He said it was me resisting the flow of life. And isn't that word resistance one of the most important things? Because we all want to be happy. We all want to live a nice life. We all want to have a great time. Sure, but it's not about that. It's not about that at all. It's not about having a great time. It's about, this is the schoolroom. This is the place where the arrows strike, the arrows that we once created with our mind and collectively together. And when these arrows strike, maybe we've got to say, wow, what an amazing opportunity. We usually can't do it until it's over and we look back and we see what the arrow was really about. But I love that thing that he called the resistance obsession. How do we resist what we have? You know, what you resist persists. So I want you to really, really think about this. I'll remain a little bit if anyone wants to ask me anything. But I want you to think about this. But there's some very amazing things, transformation and what happened to him in meditation. And what I've done is I've marked the whole book with these little orange markers so that I can go exactly where I want to go. So I think we can continue with it, because I really think when you go from the psychology into the real true nature, it helps so much.
Yeah. I think suffering like this also really tests your belief in impermanence. Because if you trust the teachings, you know, the first arrow, if you just let it be and not attach, you know it's not going to last forever.
Yeah,
but it's that ego that wants to fight it and stop the pain.
Exactly. So, sorry, I meant to give you a meditation tonight, and I got a bit carried away with the book. So let's just do the dedication. We'll just do a 1-minute meditation.
Well, what's the book called?
It's called From a Mountain in Tibet. From a Mountain in Tibet by Lama Yeshe Lossel Rinpoche. So just let's just sit for 1 minute, everybody. And just for 1 minute, I meant to give you a meditation. Just ponder your life in this moment. The great arrows in your life. See them. And open your heart to them. And know that if you sit in meditation and you allow all those feelings of anxiety, anger, resentment, resistance to come up, they'll just dissolve back into the essence. And so we dedicate to all sentient beings who are suffering on the earth plane. We really pray for all of them, every single one of them. May they look deeply into the arrow of suffering and not resist that pain, but really learn how to face it and how to cope with realizing it's all on a relative level. Sonam die tamche zipane topne nepe dranam pamshene jegana jibala rupaye sipe sole doa do warsho.